we hire for the roles based on the needs of the role and the personality fit for the party coming in to make sure that they're set up to win, right? And then it's like, how do we develop them? So if they're in the giftologist role, we set them up with sales-oriented training. How do you work with other people when it comes to different types of personalities? Like there's a training that's leaning in that side of it. If you're in a project management role, it's more about, and I train them typically on how we operate.
Our guest today is Giftology's co-founder, Rod Neuenschwander. Rod co-founded Giftology with the late John Ruhlin, a well-known speaker and the author of the book Giftology, The Art and Science of Using Gifts to Cut Through the Noise, Increase Referrals, and Strengthen Retention. Giftology is the nation's #1 relationship agency focused on identifying and propelling important relationships for clients to accelerate their growth. The company's strategies have been featured in Forbes magazine, as well as Business Insider and countless podcasts and blogs. Giftology is the leading voice in the generosity movement. Rod oversees operations and directs the strategic initiatives of the organization. He and his team continue John's legacy by teaching the marketplace that relationships take you places that marketing cannot. Rod also leads Ruhlin Partners, a firm that partners with founders or struggling companies to help them recover, grow, and successfully exit their businesses. He also talks on this show about how a co-founder or COO leads the transition after a CEO dies suddenly. On behalf of the family and the team at Giftology, we hope you love the content and will continue John's legacy and Rod's work by bringing gifting into your company. Rod, welcome to the Second in Command podcast.
Thank you, Cameron. Looking forward to being here.
This is a very rare episode because we only ever interview the COO of the company, and you're not quite COO, but I'm going to explain why this is the perfect fit in a second. So we only ever have had one CEO on the podcast before, and that was Bob Glazier, who was the founder of Acceleration Partners. And the reason I had Bob on the podcast was he was the CEO of one of our members from the COO Alliance, and he was able to speak to what he was looking for in finding a COO and bringing them on and building that amazing relationship and then having that COO transition to a CEO. So it's kind of a one-off glimpse. But the reason I wanted you on the podcast is you were a co-founder to an organization and a partner in an organization for 17 years where I was good friends with the CEO and founder. And I never knew you existed because you were very much kind of, as I call it, the backstage or the behind the scenes in a lot of the business to the CEO's front stage. So you were the partner of John Ruhlin, who just passed away recently, and we'll talk about John in a second, and the company was Giftology. But can you maybe speak to that as to how the two of you started this business off and how that backstage, front stage perception, I guess, played out for many of us at least?
Yeah, I mean, Cameron, the joke that I always had with John is that you can be the face and the voice. I'll just be the brains. I'm totally fine with that. But he obviously didn't think that was as funny as a joke as I did. But the reality of it is John was super smart. But it started back. I'll give you the quick backstory of how John and I met, and I think that will sort of answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
But John and I met through a mutual friend, and we had one of those lunch. And this is back when we were in our early 20s. One of those lunches that just went on forever, and we literally left the lunch meeting saying, you know what, we should buy companies together. Except we actually meant it. And so we started the process of actually doing that. And then through that first company that we wanted to buy, we realized the numbers weren't right. And so I agreed to come in as president of that company and run it for 2 years, and then we'd sort of see what happens. And that was our first go. And then after that, we didn't end up buying. It's a long story. I went into a much larger turnaround scenario out in Eastern PA in Philadelphia, more complicated one, and that took another 2 years or so. It was until after that John and I decided, you know what, John's like, hey, my little gifting thing that I created just sort of spinning out of control here a little bit. We should just combine forces. And so that's what we did. And in the end of the day, it was struggling pretty mightily, candidly. And so in order to just generate cash, we said, well, I'm just going to do consulting deals as part of this too, just to generate cash for the company right now. And that's what we did. And so through that time frame, we turned that little gifting operation into Giftology, and that's a process I'm sure we'll talk about later. But and then we end up helping 4 different founder of companies that were struggling or underperforming generate $30 million of wealth events as well, not including profitability in that process too. And what I really found out is that what I was good at was making the complicated simple. One of the advantages of what I call smart enough is I'm not smart enough to make it too complicated. I
Mhm.
have to take the complicated and make it simple. But what I really learned is how to partner well, and in that, especially with founders. And John was, as you know, John was the ultimate entrepreneur. I mean, there was a lot of crazy there, right? So, we worked really well together, and my role really ended up being just working with John on the back end, and we can get into the more details later. But ultimately, helping him just live out his God-given abilities and do what he does better than anybody 90% of the time.
I think that was what was really unique about it is John was a fantastic front person for the business. He was a fantastic brand. You know, the book Giftology, that is the name of your company, really had his name on it. I don't even recall your name being there. You didn't.
I was in the acknowledgments as a listed name.
Yeah. So why you didn't have the need to be a front person for the brand, and how did you rationalize that? Because you were the perfect partners, you guys were 50-50 partners in the business. How did you rationalize that in your own mind that it just wasn't important where it seems to be important for some entrepreneurs?
That's a really good question. I think for me personally is never been super critical for me to be that person. It's more, I think it goes almost back to the days when I was playing basketball in high school. There was just a teammate of mine who was just an unbelievably good athlete. And when you're in a small school, he makes everybody look like rock stars. So I'm like immortalized in this high school. And to be honest, I was an average basketball player. So I learned early in my life, like, hey, you need a Ryan Berg in your life, right? And for me, and John at that point was a winner in the little space that he was playing, but not on the national level.
Yeah.
But man, when I got to know John, I just realized this guy's superhuman talent. But more importantly than that, we had mission alignment. Like we thought like, we wanted to do the same things in life. Um, we had very offsetting skills. And so for me, that was really important. But we had a deep respect.
That was really key, right? That deep respect and foundational alignment, and then also the kind of the same vision, the shared vision. How did you decide how to divide and conquer and which roles would be yours, which would be his? How did you decide to tell him which roles should not be on his plate and like, hey, I'll take that? How did you guys work through those discussions?
It was a process. I would say in the very beginning, when we first combined, my tendency was like to try to change John. I'm like, hey, John, if you just did these three things better, I mean, our team would be so much more effective. We would have less errors. We wouldn't have this garage full of junk product that is margin leaks because there's mistakes and all this kind of stuff. I think ultimately, I just realized over the course of time, like, why does that matter? Like, if I move him from a 3 to a 5, in that he's still failing at it, and that's not helping us. Ultimately, my shift was, hey, like he does these things better than anybody else in the world that I've ever met. How do I get him to do 90% of the time there? And then that allowed me to take on the backside of it and say, if we build this organizational structure in the right way, that just allows him to do that. I changed my paradigm, and everything changed after that. And that what that ended up leading to is we were able to work more effectively operationally. So we reduced cost. We were able to scale. We were able to do these things that at a lower error rate than we've ever had before. And after that, things just sort of blew up. And by the end of it, honestly, Cameron, the only thing John ever logged into was his cell phone and his computer. Like he
Wow.
didn't even have access to any other system. And it became a natural progression for us. And John, being honest, would be like, I don't want access to those things. I want to do what I do, right? And it was never really a battle for us to understand like who would do what. It was more of like almost a natural progression. It became like, well, that's really Rod's call, and John trusted me with it, and I'd be like, that's really your call, John. I trust you with that.
There were some parts of the business that you guys have in Giftology a few different products and services. You have the speaking events where John was being paid, and I think now you've got Sarah out being booked all over the place, being paid. You had, book sales from the book Giftology. You had products that people were purchasing and gifting out. You had some consulting where you were helping companies with understanding how to bring gifting strategically into their businesses. And then you also have, I guess, an online course slash mastermind. How did you divide kind of the focus of the organization where we really only have three inputs? We have our people, we have time, and we have money, and then we have to get the highest return on those three inputs. How did you decide which products and which services to focus your time and which ones were worth it from the, I guess, gross margin generating perspective or the low pain in the ass factor?
So I have early on in our partnership, I created what I called the rule and way, was just basically I gave it to John and I'm like, hey John, here's 10 insights of like how I think and how I make decisions. And he things that he just that wasn't how he operated, like in those types of guidelines. And number three on that list is gross profit production is more important than revenue. And so for me, that has always been a driving point because so I just did, it's an economic exercise at some point, right? And so I would look at what opportunities we had that would generate the highest margin, and that's where we focused our energies. And then on top of that, then I was able to focus because John had a brain that was always thinking about what's next, right? And so I was able to take that rule and way, plus I lived in one-page plans. Like I tried to do that as much as we possibly could, so that we had, hey, this is our annual plan, and if I couldn't get it, I had to put it on one page so I could point to it all the time, so that and keep John's energies focused on what those things were, and generally those priorities were leading to what would be higher margin opportunities for us, and that's sort of how over the course of those years all those services became available.
Yeah, it was only product. Then you layered on kind of the good gross margin speaking event, but that started to pull John away from the business a little bit. How how do you focus the time of the people? How do you get them ensure they're working on the right projects, the right initiatives, spending time on the right things?
Again, I come back to the annual plan. So I look back to these annual plans after John's passing, and you can watch the progression of our company growth by looking back at our annual plans. And we accomplished almost 80% year over year. For me, that's how we do it. I meet with our team every single quarter. We're a very transparent organization. They know exactly what our priorities are and what we're focusing on. And then we meet quarterly to help them align with their activities to making sure that we're accomplishing what we put on that we collectively agreed to as the most important things in the annual plan. And then that's what I have done with every single company. It doesn't matter if it's Giftology or if it's our turnaround partner company that we're working with. We use that same model because then we can focus the energies there because it's easy to point to it.
Funny how you mentioned, you got to 80% of the plan. There's an old kind of measure that we used to use at College Pro Painters, and we called it the 87% rule. And that a company on average would end up at 87% of the cumulative goals of the team. And it was almost like the high jumper getting over the bar that, their shoulders and back might end up 6 inches over the bar, but their butt would be like a quarter of an inch. And they had to try to jump 7 feet, they had to aim for 7'4" to end up at 7. And I think a lot of companies miss that. Do you put some coverage into your plans, or do you have differences between goals and budgets when you set those out?
100%, because that's just the natural reality. Plus, sometimes things just change throughout the course of the year. Something that we thought, or either from an opportunity or just circumstances that existed economically out there, changed, and so those are just true. And so there's always some unforeseen thing that impacts your ability to accomplish something. But 100%, I definitely add a pad to it because yeah, there's just unforeseen things happen. But the opposite's also true. There's certain things that we outperformed, and there's some things that we underperformed. But the blend ended up being, just it's funny how it works almost when you look back at it. It's that
Yeah,
87 rules bring that up because when I was looking back at those plans, I was thinking to myself, oh wow, giftology at one point was just a line item in an annual plan, right? It was
sure.
all it was, and we ultimately created something out of it. But there's other things, so that worked out. But there's other things when I look back and say, oh, we thought this was going to be like a game changer, and it was a dud. Like, so sometimes you just don't know how things play out. But the blend of it was pretty much 80%.
It tends to be, and I'm not sure why. So I want to talk a little bit about the situation that you were left with when one of your closest friends, your partner of 17 years, the co-founder of Giftology, the front man, the guy on stage, passed away suddenly. And that was, 6 weeks ago, I guess now, which feels like yesterday, that you get the call. And I want to try to talk about it from the business left brain logical perspective versus the, going through pain of loss or grief of loss. But how do you lead a company through this? What happens to you when your co-founder is gone and now you're staring at a business where there was a person who was playing different roles, as you said, kind of and amongst the best in the world doing it? What happens? How do you go through that? Can you walk us through it?
So, and the left brain side's easy for me. I got to be honest with you though. This is the first time my mom passed, but last time I saw John was when he flew in to see to see me and hang out with me during my mom's funeral, and that was just like 2 weeks before John passed. And
Oh.
so I'm not an emotional guy generally,
Mm.
but I got to tell you, for whatever reason, the experience with John passing rushed me. Like
Yeah.
those first that first day, I called a company meeting and explained to them what happened. And the next day we had another follow-up meeting. Um, but it was very right brain for that first 2 days. I'm being honest, and I told them, I said, hey, if you're expecting a ten step plan that you would normally expect me to bring to you, because that was kind of my role in the organization, you're going to be really disappointed because right now I just can't get there. Like so that's just the fact of reality. But he was more like almost like a. It's kind of weird to think about it, but like my wife agreed. She's like he's more like a spouse to you than he was like a partner. And so there's a weird element there. The left brain started when I need to. For me personally, I'm sure people that are COOs in general have the same type of logic. I need to understand what the plan is to calm my mind, right?
Mm.
So what I did on that same week is I just did three things: brutal facts of reality, what's our operational plan, and what's our financial plan. I needed to come up with like those three things so that I could have and so and brutal facts of reality too. It's like, hey, John's been my partner for 18 years. He's got kids that are 4 to 13. Um, I didn't I don't see, I want to make sure I'm taking care of them. That was part of my brutal facts of reality too, right? And so I handled it that way. And then I could logically process, where we were at, what product offerings would make the most sense in the go forward, and really from a pragmatic perspective,
Mm.
say, okay, and that's what forces you to do when you do brutal facts reality. Like it's not fuzzy. It's like if it sucks, you put it on the paper, like right.
Yeah.
And what I knew is we're going to basically be eliminating um, more than half or more of our most profitable revenue, probably. And so then I just built the plan around that. Now, on the flip side, there's some foresight for us that is playing out where we had um, started developing um, product offerings that were literally called John Not Needed, which is incredibly painful to think about 3 days after your best friend's passing.
Yeah.
But and literally, Cameron, I'd like to say that was so brilliant of us, but what really happened in that story was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, John and I tried to do something similar and it failed because I think the focus was on the wrong thing of what we were trying to accomplish. The brand sort of took a shift and it made more sense. And so that our team approached us and said, "Hey, this is what we would like to do." And so we blessed that 2 years ago. We funded it. We allowed them to make a hire, which is Sarah, who you referenced earlier. And that became, as I was thinking about it pragmatically, became what it is that our future go forward looks like. And that's what I sort of centered around when I thought about everything from a very left brain pragmatic sense. This is what our plan is in the go forward.
What were some of the brutal facts that you had to deal with and that you had to walk the company through?
So, like I said, we're open and transparent. I was open and transparent with our team, and I said, here's the reality. Brutal fact and the reality number one is John's 44 years old. His youngest kid is 4 years old. I don't care how much insurance you have, it ain't enough. Right? So that's brutal facts of reality number one. Second brutal fact of reality is that we're going to lose, and I was very open with our team. we will lose the vast majority of our most profitable revenue, which was speaking revenue, because that's a straight bottom line driver. It's not scalable,
Yeah.
100%, but it's also a very profitable endeavor, right? And so that will be hard to replace in the short term. We will replace it in the long term because we have talent, but in the foreseeable future, call it a year or two, it's going to be difficult to replace that number. That was the other part of it. And then um, the other part was, candidly, we're givers, not takers by nature.
Mm.
Uh, and the last brittle factor reality for me was, I'm gonna have to be okay accepting help
Yeah.
and asking for help, which is incredibly difficult and surprisingly difficult to do for somebody like for me. But
I spoke with John's wife on the weekend, and she said the same thing for her personally, is it's very hard for her to accept all these gifts and the help from people. And I said, John's legacy is gifting,
yeah,
and you felt good gifting, and you felt good helping other people feel good gifting. You're kind of robbing us by not letting us feel good trying to help, right? That be grateful, or just be open to the fact that so many people are feeling good about being able to help, even though it's under such a hard situation. So I hope you're feeling that. But thank you for sharing those.
yeah.
Something I'm curious about on the speaking side, do you think when a company has a product or a service that is such high gross margin that's not scalable, like a speaking part of the business, does it make the business sloppy, or does it make the business, allow them to work on stuff that maybe they wouldn't be working otherwise? If you didn't have all that extra margin, would you be doing a couple of the low margin, high pain in the ass things?
I think you're 100% spot on. There's no question that makes you stop, because high gross margin revenue covers a lot of sins, right? Right. And so one of the things for me is, like, I preach margin all the time, right? And yet at the same time, one of our core our total transparency, our lowest margin offering is the core thing of what Giftology was known for, is product and gifting, right? And that's actually our lowest margin,
Right.
right? So, but yeah, you have a tendency to, be sloppy in some of those areas. Now, what we also were focusing on is a product offering that increased margin, right? And so that was part of our long-term thing too, as well. So we do have those products available as well, because our focus is always on margin generation, and value and impact onto the recipient. All those things had to matter.
Had John been more operational, had John had access to more of the software and more roles and responsibilities in many ways than being on stage and being the front person deal maker at times, what systems would you have needed to recover from that? It sounds like this, I said to you at the funeral that the company's lucky in a way that it was John that passed away and not you, because had you passed away, I don't think John could run the company. Like, we lost an unbelievable human being, but at least, you can keep the business going. What would a company need to have in place to ensure that it could have operated had you passed, or had somebody that was more tied in passed, in terms of like succession plans and systems and access to things?
That's a really good question I haven't thought about before. But in all humility, Cameron, and I'm not a boastful person, you would have to find somebody like me. Like
Yeah.
John was unbelievably superhuman in what he was gifted in, but he didn't think or operate that way. It would not be a profitable enterprise without having somebody like me fill that void. And while our team is really robust and talented, you do need somebody to lead that charge.
What should a company put in place, or what would you be putting in place now to ensure that giftology lasts for a generation past you? Like, what do companies need to have to survive something like this in terms of succession?
Our authoritative system stack is really great, and so they will live for a season without somebody like me. I think the biggest thing I would recommend is making sure that you have eyes on who that successor is, and just like we had, and some of it's dumb luck for us that we actually had Sarah. All John and I did was we blessed a request, right? And it turns out that is a huge thing that we can lean into the future. I think the opposite's true for the operations side, is that you need to have eyes on what that succession looks like. Who are the people that you're investing into? If you don't see them as part of your long-term transition plan, then I think you need to find somebody that is going to fill that role for you. I
Mhm.
think hiring from the outside, no, all companies are different. For us, hiring from the outside would be very challenging to do that. I think we almost have to grow it internally for an organization that operates like we do.
You talked about that you have like kind of a, I forget what you called it, maybe the rule and way. Is the rule and way the way that you operate, the way that other people can understand how you operate? Can you walk us through how did you document that for people and how do you share that with people? Because I think it's really smart that you give them that operating manual to Rod.
So this is this is literally I think the first year John and I could tell early on that John and I while we mutually respected offsetting skills, we didn't think about the world the same way, right? And so I felt like there's got to be some way I can better translate for him my thought pattern versus just like verbally in the heat of the moment type of discussion type things. So I just spent time going down a list and saying, what do I really, how do I really process information and what do I think is important? That's really what I did. And it's not like rocket science things, but it's clarity, right? So for me, clarity is one of the most important things to operate successfully, and that provided us just something to point to. And how I used it, then I actually used that with our anybody who wants to, you know, in our more less public side of the company, where I was doing turnarounds, working with other founders underneath the same brand. They would share that with them too, because they need to understand how I think. Otherwise, I don't want to work with somebody that's not that we can't come to alignment, right? So,
Mm.
and this is just giving them a quick glance of like, hey, this is the operations of like, and it's things like I just mentioned, like distributable cash flow is more important than gross margin is more important than revenue alone, and then I have commentary on why that's important. Distributable cash flow to members is more important than just earnings, like, and why I think that's important, right? And how I look for partnerships that optimize those opportunities, down to things like I have it right here to see other things that were on there that were important to me that I actually learned lessons for, like only invest with partners you can trust, um, and why that's important. And if we had a failure at times, it's because I look back to it, it's like, well, gosh, I didn't listen to my own advice. Three out of the four of these things were not part of this, and we've let the opportunity of riches blind us to something
Like
that we are predetermined, right?
I know that you and the Giftology group are working on John's second book, and it's going to be
Yeah,
coming out in March. But it sounds like you've got the content there for a third book. So hopefully you
yeah.
decide to write, because I think you could turn the Rule and Way into your third book, and it would be quite
Well, I
successful.
have a title for it too. So it's a funny thing, but it's not funny. But when I was a kid, my dad, I grew up in an Amish country and dairy on a dairy farm in Amish country, and my dad unfortunately had an accident when I was 3 years old, and he lost his right arm, and so he and so I was raised by a one-armed dairy farmer is the joke. But I have so how I structure like life lessons for my teenagers and my kids are like lessons learned from a one-armed dairy farmer.
That's great.
I think I'll use the lessons, but I was gonna title it that. But John's like, why aren't you writing that book? I'm like, well, we got other things to do.
I guess the good side is your dad couldn't grab you and hit you because he only had one arm, right? So he couldn't do.
Yeah, right. But the thing about this is like the what the thing about I cannot remember one time hearing him complain. Not a
Wow.
single time in my entire life about it.
Wow.
We complained when to your point, he had accidentally hit us in the head with his artificial arm sometimes, but
Okay.
he never complained. So like life lesson to me was like, hey, he did that with grit and perseverance, but he did it with grace. And so I think that's have a lot to be said for how we operated and how we want to operate.
I can definitely see that. You talked a little bit about emerging leaders, and I'm curious on what you do in terms of focusing on growing the skills and the capacity and the confidence of the emerging leaders inside of the Giftology group.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of that has been accelerated recently. I'd like to say that we had this focus more. I regret not having it more focused as we were continuing to build, but more recently it became even more front and center. I think the biggest thing is what we do is we hire well. So we hire for the roles based on the needs of the role and the personality fit for the party coming in to make sure that they're set up to win, right? And then it's like, how do we develop them? So if they're in the giftologist role, we set them up with sales-oriented training. How do you work with other people when it comes to different types of personalities? Like there's a training that's leaning in that side of it. If you're in a project management role, it's more about I train them typically on how we operate.
I want to talk a little bit about advisors before we wrap. You mentioned that, reaching out to advisors, and you knew you'd have to go to advisors and ask for help. How are you gaining the best advice from advisors? What advice could you give to others that maybe could benefit from advisors around them? And how do you even decide which advisors to listen to and which ones to try to not, consider their thoughts?
Um, that's a great question. For me, I was looking at the knowing where we're going organizationally. So I think your understanding of where you want to take the organization to me matters a lot on who you're selecting and what voices are going to be heard the loudest. And so I was seeking out people that I respected, number one, um, and um, knew that they were going to speak truth. Like I don't need people to like I want to hear brutal facts to reality, right? Otherwise, it doesn't help me. So people that would be willing to have that, but also had built something similar to what we're leaning into to help us speed that time frame up and accelerate that pace. Were the really the three major things that I used to select in a group size that would be productive, and so that I could make sure that I could um, have consistent attendance, but not have like 30 people, but just the right number that I can be have candid conversations with and be able to pull back the curtain a little bit and more than you would in a regular public type setting, just to say, hey, this is candidly where we're at, and this is where we need to go from my perspective. Like, help me think about how to do this, and are we in the right area?
Well,
In the right.
there's a lot to be said for the partnership and what you built at Giftology, that you have a huge network of people that want to help, not only for the legacy of what John did and left, but also because we like his partner. So it does speak volumes that we like him as much, or we like you as much as he did. I want to
Yeah.
wrap with a question that normally I ask: what advice would you give to the younger self? But I think I'd rather ask, what advice do you wish you had gotten from John when you were 21 or 22 that now you know to be true, but you wish he'd told you at a much younger age? What do you think he could have passed on, that you could have benefited from when you were much younger?
So your partner with John, like I was, I joke about it, but like the crazy side, like, but there's truth behind that. Like, so the Cameron Brooks, the Brooks Brothers story, for example, is an example of that. Um, I literally, as we were driving up to Cleveland for that, I said, John, this is a bad idea. I literally told him, I said, Cameron, if you want to do this for Cameron, I get it, I guess. I'm not sure I'm fully understanding this, but if you want to do it, and by this point, you have to understand I was funding the company, right? At that
Right,
point, number
right.
I had the cash from previous life, and so I was like propping this up, and I'm like, that's a lot of money to me at that point. I'm like, if you want to do this, it's coming from your equity if it fails. He's like, deal, right? But so when you start there, I always said I was the boring and consistent one, and he was the crazy. But literally over the last 18 years, somehow there's a merge of that. Like my
Mm.
consistent became more crazy, and his crazy became more strategic, and there's a realness in that. And I think that was John's influence over me over 18-year period that just can't be replaced. And I think that actually helped me with all the other founders we led because there's always a little crazy. It manifests itself differently, but for me, that just exists, and that's John's gift to me in perpetuity. I think is.
I love that. I love that the crazy in a way is just bring some good, positive, fun energy in as well, right? And just bring that energy into or that out of the box thinking into the business, because I think we need to stay with that.
Yeah.
Ron Neuenschwander, the co-founder of the Giftology Group, thanks so much for sharing with us today, for chatting about the business, about John Ruhlin, and some great advice that you've been able to impart. I really appreciate the time.
Hey, thank you, Cameron. I appreciate it.
In ClickUp, we see the same thing. Our biggest value comes down to that entrepreneurial spirit, right? So we care a lot about growth mindset. We care a lot about being the underdog. We care about working really hard. Those are the ideal employees that work for us. Our best employees are actually not the people who come with big pedigree. Hiring for drive and ambition and betting on that